In this video, we're going to talk about using Spring Framework in conjunction with RESTful web services. So Spring itself does have very robust support for creating and consuming RESTful web services. Spring Framework has three distinct web frameworks for creating RESTful services, being that server-side code, being the provider of the RESTful services. And then also there are two distinct web client libraries for consuming RESTful web services. Now, there are several popular libraries for creating and consuming RESTful services with Spring. These are not covered in the course. These are popular Java libraries. You can use them, but in this course, I will be focusing on, obviously, the Spring components that are available for RESTful web services. Now, Spring Web MVC. This is the oldest and most commonly used library for creating RESTful web services with Spring. This is actually part of the core of Spring Framework. This is compatible with Java EE, also Jakarta EE, which is a rebranding. This is going to be available inside of Spring 6. This does follow the MVC paradigm, Model View Controller, and it has very robust support for traditional web applications. So this is really the workhorse of traditional Spring in terms of web applications, also can be used for RESTful APIs. This is based on the traditional Java Servlet API. By nature, this is blocking and non-reactive. The Servlet API itself is blocking. So that this is kind of legacy code. It's been around for a very, very long time, very popular to use. But the Servlet API itself does have blocking components in it. So that is something to be aware of if you want to get to reactive, which is where Spring WebFlux steps in. This was introduced with version 5 of the Spring Framework. This uses Project Reactor under the cover to provide reactive web services. This does not use the Java Servlet API, thus it is able to be non-blocking because it is not tied to that API. This does follow very closely the configuration model of Spring MVC. This library does provide a very easy transition for developers that are accustomed to using traditional Spring MVC. Also, almost a subset of that is WebFlux.fn. This is also introduced in Spring Framework 5. WebFlux.fn is a functional programming model used to define endpoints. It's actually kind of very flexible and very open to rapid development. So I really like WebFlux.fn, and we'll be looking at that more depth. This is an alternative to annotation-based configuration. And again, you can really rapidly define some microservice endpoints with it. Now, Spring REST template. This is a web client. This is the primary library for a long time for consuming RESTful web services. It's very mature. It's been part of Spring for a very long time. It's very configurable. So right now, this is in maintenance mode. There are no new features, so this is kind of like a step before deprecation. At this point in time, Spring is recommended to use web client for new development, but if you are using this or if you wish to use it, I don't think that's going to be a problem. It is not deprecated yet at this point in time, and it's truly one of the workhorses of the Spring Framework, so I will be showing it and using it in this course. I use it all the time. I actually go between this and web client. Now, web client, that was also introduced in Spring Framework 5. This is Spring's reactive web client. Underneath the covers, it uses Reactor Netty, which is a non-blocking HTTP client library. So you do get some efficiencies using this in terms of being non-blocking, and it is new. There's been some development, and Spring is actively developing this client, adding more features and functionality to it. It is mature, and I use it. Like I said, I use both. Both are there to use, and you should be fluent in both because you will see both being used out in the workplace. Now, marshalling and unmarshalling. This is the act of converting POJOs to JSON. So if you're converting a POJO, a Java object, to JSON or XML, which is essentially a text document, that is called marshalling. And then converting from JSON or XML to Java objects, that is called unmarshalling. By default, Spring Boot configures Jackson to facilitate marshalling and unmarshalling. So remember, when we are converting from the Java world to the HTTP response to provide JSON, or we are taking in a request that has JSON in it, that is going to be what we're using, convert from JSON or XML to the Java world and vice versa. Spring Boot does support several other libraries. Jackson is by far the most popular and I think the most mature, so we will be focusing on Jackson in this course, but I do want to make you aware if you have a different library that you would like to use, Spring Boot does support several others, but I will not be covering those. Then RESTful APIs are often combined with SPA applications, so single page applications. There are a lot of popular client-side frameworks such as Vue, Backbone, React, Angular, or Ember. There's a lot of times I get the question, which framework is the best to use to Spring Boot? The correct answer to that is it really doesn't matter. It's important to understand that the framework being used on the client side, that gets completely decoupled from Spring. So we are intentionally providing a generic layer that's HTTP, JSON, or XML, so anything can consume it. All these libraries can consume RESTful APIs. It's very, very common with these. The server side itself can be Spring Boot, could be .NET, could be Ruby, just about anything. But when you're going through a RESTful API, it completely abstracts it. So I see a lot of beginning developers that don't fully understand this distinction. It honestly does not matter. All these libraries do have capabilities. You might get into some nuances as to how the JSON is being formatted to be consumed or a preferred way. These are typical nuances, and usually Jackson or whatever library you're using does have control over that. But it's important to understand you have that abstraction that decouples the front-end technology, so you can be using any front-end technology you wish to provide a very rich user experience with your application. You do have that abstraction, that decoupling through HTTP and JSON. So the client-side library, what the technology being used there really doesn't matter. Your client library and server libraries are completely decoupled from each other. So there is no, air quotes, best one to use it. So I want to take a point at this point in the course to stress that you can use whatever front end you want with Spring Boot. It really doesn't matter.